I've got to get the usual questions answered for you before I can fully explain my situation. I was adopted when I was around 18 months old through an agency that works through the Estonian government. There was literally no known facts about either one of my biological parents besides a very small leather pouch with some sort of granular substance in it that I was told my biological mother insisted vehemently that I keep possession of. It came with a note that instructed that I should wear it until it hurts me. My adoptive parents considered it the ramblings of a troubled young woman and put it into storage until I was old enough to decide what to do with it. My adopted parents were about as American gets. Dad was a construction contractor for big projects in Chicago, and Mom was a school teacher. We lived in an outer suburb of Chicago that was as pleasant and safe as you'd expect. If I were to complain in any way, shape, or form about my upbringing, I would be an entitled dimwit. As much as I hate to say it, my childhood was perfect. My parents loved me. I never went without a need or even a want, and my future was pretty secure by the time I left the nest. My parents will always be the parents I believe I was meant to have. The reason behind my sudden interest and my genealogy is more of a medical issue. You see, I was in year 3 of my bachelor's in architecture when the episode started. One minute I was presenting blueprints for my class assignment, and the next thing you know, I woke up in an emergency room to the murmurs of nurses calling for more blood. After several tests for leukemia and iron deficiencies, or simply any disease related to blood, there was still no answer to why my blood pressure and levels seemingly vanished into thin air. The doctor, while trying to make things lighthearted, joked that I must just need more of it than most people. After 4 months of several more attempts with supplements and immune boosters, I was eventually sent home from school and given the option to complete my degree through online classes. I had passed out so many times and awoken to blood transfusions that the college staff deemed in-person classes for me to be a hazard to myself and others around campus. My parents wanted me to move back in with them, but I pleaded for their assistance with getting an apartment for myself. I needed to feel like a progression forward in life was still possible. They agreed to this if I agreed to wear one of those heart monitoring bracelets. Once settled into my new place, I continued in my studies, but I had another mission in mind. If the doctors couldn't find any answers, then my problem had to be genetic, so I signed up with every genealogy service in existence and sent in my samples. In the meantime, my condition got worse. Twice my parents had rushed me to the ER for more transfusions, but my recovery times were getting longer and longer, and then the dream started. The first one started out as seeing myself 10 years from now with a wife, a house down the street from my parents, and a couple of kids. The next thing I knew, the entire neighborhood was engulfed in flames and darkness, and my bride was screaming and pleading with me to stop as I looked down and realized I was completely soaked in blood. Then I woke up in a state of utter hysteria to the usual face of my routine nurse telling me to take a chill pill and go back to sleep. I had been out of it for 4 days, I was told. What's even more curious is that the doctors soon discovered that, despite basic precipices of medicine and science, my body simply needed blood, and this meant any blood. The type no longer mattered, as any transfusion kept me alive and created sustainable results. The next episode also resulted in a much longer dream. This one started out similarly, as I was actually flying through the night sky. I could see the clouds below me and the distant lights of air traffic and cell towers. I felt as though I could stay up there forever, but then I sensed a dark-looking figure descending down upon me and found myself being gripped by some sort of claw and jetting straight down through the skies and towards an ocean. "You're mine now" was all I heard right into my ear in a deep and ominous voice before my impending collision with the water. When I awoke this time, I'd been out for 11 days. My body was beginning to wither away, as I could now see most of my own bone structure, and my skin was pale and littered with tiny blue veins that were rising to the surface. My eyes had become so sensitive to natural light that I needed my room to remain curtained at all times. My parents and I wept together on afternoon, because we all knew where this was headed, and there was no hope given by the doctors. When it became evident that my hospital bed would now be my eventual coffin, my parents brought me my laptop and usual paraphernalia from home. I insisted on continuing my studies because, at this point, it's all I had. After all, if I wasn't studying, I was sleeping, and that only meant that I would experience countless renditions of the presence in my nightmares haunting and preying on me in various dream state scenarios that would leave me in a puddle of sweat and terror. I was in the middle of checking emails when I noticed a new email in my unread. It read as follows: "Hello there, I'm inquiring into your interests on genealogy. You might have noticed by now that none of your results have been returned to you by the various companies that you employed to look into this. I can assure you that this is by no mistake, as I am the one responsible for your information being withheld. I am a powerful man with means that are beyond your limited comprehension, and my ability to infiltrate or alter information anywhere and anytime is endless. You see, I had a son, the only son I've ever known in my long life, but he was taken from me by his mother a little over 19 years ago. Somehow, with all my means, I was unable to track him down, even after I reconvened with his mother. Given your very unique blood markers, I feel it's safe to say that you are that son that I've longed for. I must also assume that you might be at death's doorsteps given our unique family characteristics. Just know that I will be with you soon, and not only will I be able to help you recover from your current state, but eventually you'll come to find your true potential and conquer this world in your own way. See you soon, my son, Mr. DeVille." I didn't have long to think about this when the hospital alarms sounded. Assuming it to be a fire outbreak, nurses were yelling and carting people every which way before the screams started. First from a few floors down, and eventually just below us. The screams were guttural, and will likely etch into my memory until I'm gone from this life. I tried to scramble out of bed, but all I managed to do was knock the box of my personal items off of the nightstand next to me. That's when I noticed it for the first time in a long time, laying there on the floor. It was the pouch my biological mother had sent with me, and it was spilled out on the floor. Out of a desperation for anything to hold on to, I reached for it, but as soon as my hand made contact with granules, my skin burned. It was then that my sense of smell kicked in, and I realized, finally, that it was simply garlic powder. I finally took notice that the screaming that had intensified all through my own hospital floor had subsided. Only the sounds of one casual stride of footsteps could be heard as someone approached my room, paused for a second in front of the door. Blood began to pool from the hallway and into my room. As the door slowly swung open, "It's time to face your destiny, my son." I had no time to think about what to do, as my biological father literally glided across the floor to my bedside, so I acted on my first instincts. Even though contact with the outside of the old leather pouch had burned me, I suspected the whole of the contents inside could do far more damage to him if I played the scenario in my favor, so I attempted to slowly set up in my bed while maintaining eye contact with him. I'll be honest, I didn't expect to be taken back by the seemingly sincere expressions on his face. He wasn't pale or menacing, and he didn't have red eyes. Nothing malicious came across in what I was seeing in that moment. Truth is, he looked like an average, middle-aged European man. He stood about 5'10", had dark brown hair, a strong jawline with 5 o'clock shadow, and his eyes were hazel. His voice, that had seemed so ominous when he entered the room, was soft but direct. He then asked me how I was feeling. I hesitated, but began to describe the breakdown of my body, which you could tell he already assumed by the knowing look in his eyes. He assured me that all would be well in just a matter of moments, and that's when he snapped his fingers and walked in the head nurse from down the hall, as though she was marching to dove unheard orders. Her eyes were nothing but white and veiny, and she commenced to stand directly in front of me in a solid state of otherworldly control and hold her left arm out in front of my face. That's when DeVille informed me that this was my cure and my key to unlocking a future of vast opportunities. I could literally begin to smell the blood pulsating just under her skin, and realized that despite my denial, I fully understood what I was becoming and what I would need to do in order to survive. I didn't hesitate when it came to what needed to be done next. I began to stoop forward towards her outstretched arm, but jumped to the floor and grabbed the pouch. It burned me as I suspected, but I pretended to have fallen over and held it close to my chest as my father attempted to pull me up. That's when I turned and threw the contents into his face. The moment those granules hit his skin, his literally face caught on fire, and he began to shriek and curse me. His composure was no longer meek, but rather of an angry and irate beast that I knew had every intent of killing me once he recovered, as he writhed on the floor and continued to shriek in a way that reminded me of what movies portray large prehistoric beasts to sound. With nothing but sheer will and what remaining adrenaline I had, I dove out into the hallway and dragged myself down the hall. I made it to the end to the glass doors that I knew would lead to the blood bank. I pondered for just a moment, but I knew I had no other choice as I smashed the case in and grabbed a handful of IV bags. I reasoned that this blood was willfully donated, albeit for not this reason, but certainly not via violent methods. I immediately started chugging on the first one I could open. The first taste almost made me hurl, but within seconds the blood began to taste like the most beautiful mix of both honey and the finest steak you ever partaken in. When it was all said and done, I had downed close to a dozen bags, but realized that I was now standing fully upright and felt like I could run a 5K. That's when I spotted DeVille down the hall and striding towards me with a considerable labor to his steps, but the blood on his face told me that the head nurse I left in the trance in that room had suffered the consequences of my actions. This hall was a dead end, and I realized that he was gaining strength by the moment as his gait towards me began to increase in speed. I did the only thing that seemed logical based on what I knew about what I had become. I grabbed the whole remaining rack of blood transfusions, jumped head first out the window of that 13th story room. You always imagine that you'll have time to realize what was happening if you ever fell from a distance, but the reality was that my right side hit that pavement in just a mere moment of thought, and the wind was completely knocked out of me. As soon as I came to my senses, I used my left arm to open another transfusion and chugged it. This gave me just enough strength to stand upright, although I realized my right hand had been broken and was now bent at a 90-degree angle, but I could feel it begin to correct itself as I bounded around the other to the entrance of the hospital. I had never been so thankful to see a full and chaotic crowd of people scattered across the front entrance of the hospital as staff at EMS were still evacuating. Something caught my peripherals, and I realized that DeVille was scaling down the walls of the building and towards me. When he locked eyes with me, I didn't have time to think. I just knew I needed to disappear, and fast, so I dove into the crowd and then found my way to the nearest ambulance. To my fortune, the ambulance was empty when I climbed into the back, so I shut the back doors and climbed to the front where I found the keys still in the ignition with it still running. I don't know the extent of my father's abilities, so I took a gamble and decided the best approach was to calmly pull away and hope no one noticed their vehicle being hijacked. Somehow, I actually got away with this, and once I made it around the block, I laid it down to the pedal and turned the lights on. That's when I heard and felt it, my father's voice, as though he was sitting right next to me in the passenger seat along with an intense pressure in my temples. You understand that there must be consequences for your defiance, don't you? I yelled for him to get out of my head and felt the relief as he left me. I floored it to the nearest shopping mall to ditch the ambulance and the parking lot. I grabbed a spare set of EMS attire from the back and reasoned it was better than a hospital gown. I had just made it into the mall and decided to make use of this outfit and asked to use a stranger's cell phone. Surprisingly, the first guy I pleaded with turned me down, but the lady standing next to him surrendered her phone. It didn't get to the second ring before I heard my adopted mother's phone pick up, but a moment of silence hung in the air before I recognized the voice of my adopted father pleading with someone in the background. That's when DeVille began to speak. In time, you will understand this moment to be a quintessential turning point in your life. That's when the call was switched to video, and before I could process what I was seeing, I realized that DeVille's hand not holding the phone had transformed into a large and dark web of fingers with one outstretched middle claw. He then casually ran it under my mother's chin before subtly swiping beneath it. The blood simply sprang freely from her carotid artery as I stared into the only mother I'd ever known's eyes as the life left them. My adopted father yelled with all of his might before the phone dropped, and surmised that what I was now hearing was his own throat being torn away, along with primal sounding slurps emanating through the phone line. And then a pause. "See you soon, my son." I hung up the phone immediately and shoved it back into its owner's grasp as I ran into the parking lot. I'm ashamed to admit this, but I once again used the outfit I was wearing to commandeer something, and this time it was a sweet little old lady's car. A short while later, as I sped eastward on the interstate, my plan began to formulate. I need to find a way to get to Estonia.